In this module, we're going to look at how to import data from the web. You need to have requests installed for this. The previous lecture video should have told you how to do that. So once you have requests installed, the next thing to do is that we're actually just going to get the content of a page from the web. We're going to start with some pretty simple examples, and then we'll work our way up. So we're going to say page will be our variable that's going to store what we pull down. And then we're going to use the requests module and the command get, and then we can just give a URL for that. So we'll just start with Google. And then we can print page. Now that's not going to give us exactly what we want, but it'll allow us to get started. We don't need that semicolon there. So request.get will get the page that's at the URL that comes as the argument. So if we save this and run it, we just get this weird thing, response 200. That means the page was retrieved successfully, but we're not actually seeing what's on the page. So this page object actually has a whole bunch of information in it. To see the text of the page, we're actually going to do page.text. So that's the only change that we make. And then if we run our script again, now we get this whole crazy mess of stuff. What is this? This is actually what is on the Google page, not the content that you see rendered as HTML, but it's the HTML behind. So if you haven't ever looked at that, we can go to Google and you can do, it's Command U, or you can do View Page Source, and this actually shows you the underlying HTML, which looks a lot like what just got dumped on our screen for us. So this is a sort of more complicated page. We could look at something simple. So I already have open here this link to the College Park Airport weather from NOAA. This is an XML file, so it's rendered nice on this page, but this is really just plain XML formatted data in the background. This link is in Canvas, so you can just copy that, and I'm going to put that in place of google.com here. So if we put that in there and then rerun our script, you can see we actually get something. It's a little bit messy, but we can read what's going on here. So we've got a bunch of tags, and between the tags, we've got the content. So in this case, the credit goes to NOAA's National Weather Service. If we scroll down a little bit, we have latitude and longitude of the airport, when the last update was, what the weather is, the temperature in a few different formats, and so on. So this is XML. If you're not familiar with XML, there's a few links posted in Canvas, so you can kind of read up on some background for that. But the basic format of XML is that we have tags, and then we have content inside those tags. Start tag has a name like this, and then it's always closed with an end tag that has the same name, but a forward slash in front of it, which you can see in all of these examples. So that's kind of the basics here of using this get command. You give a URL, and then page.text gives you back the text that's on the page. Now, what are we going to do with this? So there's a bunch of stuff that you can do. You can use this to read in web pages and then scrape the HTML on them, so kind of look for formatted data and extract that. You can use it to read in formatted files like XML and JSON and read those, process that data, and you can put it into other formats. You can do some data science with it. This really opens up the world of working with data that's online instead of just working with files that you have already downloaded. And so for the example to work with this today, we're actually going to stick with something that's based on XML, but what we're actually going to look at is a format called RSS. So we're going to go to this website, XKCD. This is a web comic that you all might enjoy because it's got a lot of data science and math and computing, but they also have a really easy to deal with RSS feed. So RSS stands for really simple syndication. It was really created when blogs were becoming popular and people started following lots of blogs, and since those are not aggregated in one place like social media, RSS feeds allowed the blogs to basically post a little XML file that would show last time they were updated, and then people had their own RSS aggregators or RSS readers where they would essentially subscribe to all the blogs that they cared about, and then they could just go there and they'd see whenever they checked in which blogs had been updated, and they could link to the new posts. So it was sort of like a pre-social media way to keep track of what everyone was doing and see when there were new updates. It now is used, of course, on lots of different platforms, but also forms the foundation for podcasts. So podcasts are essentially RSS feeds that have MP3 files linked instead of just linking to a blog post. So it's actually still a widely used format. We're going to look at the one here on XKCD. So we're going to do view source, which you can find in your menus up here, or just do Control or Command U. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. And what you can see if we zoom in here is that we have got these two formats. Atom is another version of RSS, just a more updated version. So here we see the RSS feed, and you can see that the address is just rss.xml. If we click on that, here it's a kind of messed up version. That's because we're viewing the source. If we take that view source off, now we see a slightly better formatted RSS feed. And so if we examine this, what you can see is that what we have are a bunch of items. Each item has a title, a link, a description, a date, and then this GUID, which gives you essentially another version of the link. And then each item is formatted in the same way. XML allows you to create whatever tags you want, use them in whatever combination you want. RSS is based on XML, but it has a predefined set of tags. These are also linked and described in Canvas. But we can see them all at use here. So you have items that have titles, links, descriptions, and dates, essentially. And so we know if we can parse those out, we could, for example, build our own little RSS reader or podcast subscription service that's going to read these items in from an RSS feed, parse them out, and then show you what are the options that are available for you. So just to look at this also in the podcast context, this is a podcast that I run. My dogs are pretty popular on social media, and we have a podcast for them. And if we go to the settings for my podcast here and go to content, you can see RSS feed is the first link here. This is essentially how people subscribe to your podcast. So they don't really need that URL now because they tend to subscribe through an app, and the app is able to find that RSS feed. But if you start a podcast and you want it to show up on like iTunes so people can subscribe through that, or on Google Play, you submit your RSS feed. So I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to paste it over here in Chrome, just because that's going to give it nicely formatted. And you can see that there's a bunch of stuff up at the top. But basically, once we get down in here, we have the same thing. Items that have this GUID that's got a link, titles, publication dates, and then the actual link. And then there's additional tags added in here for iTunes because iTunes likes their own tags. but everything basically uses that standard format. And so if we can process RSS, it means we could write a podcast app in Python because it can do the most important thing, which is follow an RSS feed, parse it out, and then see when there's new updates. So that's what we're going to work with. And you can pick whatever RSS feed you want. I'll include the link to this one on Canvas just so you have one that you can copy and paste. But anyone will work, so find your favorite blog, check around on podcasts that you follow and see if you can find their RSS feed. You can use that in your code. Okay, now we're going to use a Python tool called Feed Parser that you use in combination with requests. It's able to parse out the tags in an RSS feed. So we have to install that. We're going to do this the same way that we did with requests. So say Python flag m pip install feed parser. So Python flag m says use our Python parser, and then we're going to use pip to install, and then we give the name of a module. Feed parser is the module. Hit enter, and that should go ahead and install that for you. Okay, so I let that go ahead and run. Now we have that installed, and I'm just going to copy feed parser because we're going to come back to our script and import feed parser. Okay, for our page that we're going to get, we have this XML file in there, but now we're going to start working with RSS feeds. So feed parser actually has its own ability to request a file. So I'm just going to mark these as how to read a file from the web. And then what we're going to do with feed parser, we'll call how to read with feed parser. Okay, so I'm going to jump back over here and copy the URL for this RSS feed because we're going to need that. So our command is feed parser.parse, and then we give the URL, which I'm just going to paste in. Now that is going to run the command, but we need to store that in a variable, so I'll call that podcast equals this command. And then for now, let's just print podcast. Save that, and let's try to run it. Now it's going to show us an object, which is what we have there, but just to see that this is working. Okay, and it actually prints a pretty nice version of the podcast here. So you can see this is structured like an object, but we can see the text here. So we've got names, we've got some iTunes tags, we've got descriptions in here, all sorts of good content. So that's sort of been parsed out for us, but it's stored in an object. And so now what we want to do is be able to access the different parts of that object. So if we come back to our code, we have to know what are the ways that we can get into this object. So to do that, we're going to come over here and take a quick look at the feed parser documentation. Again, this is linked for you on Canvas, but I'm just going to take you through it. The main thing that we care about here is the reference. And so you can see we have stuff called entries, and then for each entry, so this square brackets I means that we essentially have a list here, so we can do entries square bracket 0, 1, 2, whatever, how many there are. And then for each one of those, we have a number in the square brackets. Here's all the attributes that we have. So author, comments, content, all of these different attributes that are going to be read out of that RSS feed. We also can get information about the feed. So from our object, we can do podcast.feed. And then from that, we have another object that will tell us stuff about the podcast. What's the author? What's the ID? What's the URL of the image? And so on. We'll try a couple of those. And then there's some other general information about the podcast or about the RSS feed. But we're going to stick with feed and entries. All right, so let's pick a few of these to look at. We're going to look at feed.author. And let's also look at feed.title. So feed.author and feed.title. If we come back to our code here, we'll go ahead and just print these podcast.feed.author and podcast.feed.title, just to see what that does. All right, so if we refresh this and run it, great. So you can see the author is the Golden Ratio, that's the name of our account, and then the title is the Golden Ratio Podcast. You'll also notice when we run this, if we watch, that there's a pause here. And that pause is because the code is actually going out onto the web and retrieving that file. So what you're seeing is the delay as it sends out that command and waits for the file to come back. So just to get on that structure a little bit, podcast is our object that feed parser has given us from parsing this. And then we're using the attribute feed within that object. And feed itself is an object that has an attribute author. So if we think back to what we've done the last couple weeks with object-oriented programming, you can imagine that what we have here is a class called podcast. There's also a class called feed. And within the podcast, we know that, within the podcast class, we know that each instance will have its own feed object. Each feed object has variables for author and title that belong to each feed. And so we're accessing those here just using dots. So for our podcast object, we say, give me the feed object. And from that feed object, we ask for the author or the title. So that's just so you can kind of connect classes that you haven't written to kind of what the structure looks like in the background. So let's also take a look here now at entries. So entries is a list. Again, our podcast object will have a list for each podcast instance called entries. That's going to be all of the entries. If we were just to print off podcast.entries, we're printing a list here. And so we get a big blob of stuff printing out, but you can see that it's a list because it starts and ends with that square bracket. Now, what is it a list of? Well, it's a list of entry objects, and each object would, so you can imagine there's an entry class. Each one has author, content, created, and so on, all of these things. So let's take a look at author and let's say title. And we're going to do that just for the first entry to start, and then we'll look at how we can loop through and print those all out. So we're going to look at the author and the title. So we come back to our code. We're just going to do this for our first one. So entries.author and entries, we'll leave that, dot title. So this is for a particular, in the case of podcast, a particular episode of the podcast. If we run that code, we can see let's see, what did we print out here? Author and title. So the author is still the golden ratio because that's the author of the podcast as a whole. And then the title of the most recent episode is Secrets of GR Mom's Past. That's me. It sounds like a very exciting episode, but it just talks about me touching a painting in a museum that I shouldn't have. So you're welcome to go listen, but you're not going to find any fancy secrets in there. So let's say we want to do this for all the entries. We could say for I in the range of the length of podcast.entries. So basically, I is going to be our index, and it's going to go from 0 until however long this list of entries are. Then we'll print, we don't need to print the author because that's always going to be the same. We'll just print the title, and we'll put I there in our square brackets. So this is the normal kind of loop that you have for a list. And if we save that and rerun our script, oh, I have the same error that you've seen make all semester, which is I forgot my colon at the end here. So that goes at the end of our 4. Try it again. Okay, and now we get a full list of all the episodes in here, starting with episode 0 all the way up to the current episode. So essentially what we've done here is taken an XML document on the web that is formatted with this RSS particular format of XML. We use the feed parser module, which allows us to essentially parse that XML without having to write our own XML parser. And now we're able to go through and see particular entries that are on that podcast. And so you can run this code now on any podcast just by finding the URL of its RSS feed and putting that in place of the one that we had here. So if we try one more, this is the podcast My Favorite Murder, which is one of my favorite ones, a very popular podcast. Here we found them on Podbay. We can click on Open RSS Feed. And all right, so it's trying to open that file, which is not what we want. But if we mouse over this, let's copy this link, copy link location, and paste that in here and see if that's going to give us the right format. All right, now it doesn't end in .rss, but we can see it starts with that, so that might work. I actually have not tried this before. I just want to show you that you really can go out on the web, find an RSS feed, and make it work, so hopefully this will work. So we just pasted in that different URL, but it's using RSS, it's in the same format, and so if we rerun this, nothing prints out. All right, so let's debug this and see if it's just a mistake. I did just pause this video to check, and it is printing RSS if I run it in Chrome. So let's just print podcast and see if it's able to get stuff. Okay, so what we're getting here is a security exception, which is a little bit annoying, but it doesn't mean our code was wrong. It just means we didn't get it. So let's see if we can fix that by getting rid of the S on the HTTP so we're not trying to get it securely. All right, so that looks better. It looks like a mess, but that's just because we were printing the whole object. So we'll get rid of those comments. So now we're doing basically exactly what we were doing before. All I did was drop the S. So we're not trying to do secure access to this RSS feed. We're just doing regular HTTP access, normal web access, and that hopefully will work for us. Great. And so now what we get is a whole list of all of their many, many episodes. This podcast has been going on for 3 or 4 years, so lots of episodes. Works great. Let's try one more. So we'll try This American Life, podcast RSS. Again, I'm just trying this out right now with you. Okay, so we're going to copy their URL here, and then we're just going to take the one that we have, replace it with the one that we just copied, leave all the rest of the code the same. And if we run that, great. So now we get a list of the most recent episodes of that podcast. We have a much shorter list here, even though you can see the episode numbers are really long. And that's because some podcasts only put like the most recent, say 10 things in their RSS feed, so you don't get the whole feed. And that could be that they archive the rest of the episodes, you have to pay for them. It could be they just don't like the big long list showing up. But in any case, it's still working, it's processing it just fine. And so what we have here now is the basics of a podcast app. We're doing kind of the most basic part, which is showing what the episodes are, but we know that for the entries, we also have a link, and that's something that you could potentially download. And so we're getting the basics of how you take data that's out there on the web and processing it in a way that is going to allow you to make it useful to people or applications.